As Sarah said, I am with Safer States, and if you are unfamiliar with who we are an alliance of state, local, and national groups working to eliminate toxic chemicals from our lives and environment. And we have been around for 20 years, and we really and our theory of change really is that we can achieve a safer and healthier marketplace through going to the states. We have tried several times doing things in Congress, and um, if it was hard before, it's impossible now. But what we have found is that states are far more likely to institute protections against harmful chemicals and protecting their residents. And we are able to leverage that into also retailer commitments and retailer action. And so that's really how we see us creating a healthier environment by instituting state policy and market policies. You can get national protection without having to set foot in Congress. Oh, oh gosh, what did I do? Hold on a minute. I'm gonna have to use my mouse. So there are really, as we see it, a few key elements to safer chemicals and materials policy. Overarching all of these is the idea that governments and corporations have a responsibility to ensure a safe and healthy world. And not everybody actually agrees with that, with that point of view, but that is definitely Safer State's point of view. And all of the advocates that we work with, that is our point of view. And we go about looking at chemicals through what we call a hazard-based framework or a hazard-based lens. So what does that mean? So first and foremost, it means eliminating the worst chemicals. There are a number of chemicals that have been evaluated for their ability to cause harm. And there are a number of great organizations out there that have really ranked those chemicals and looking at, the worst, it really kind of like four steps of, you have like red level, orange, yellow, green. And so what we are really trying to do right now is to eliminate the most hazardous chemicals, and PFAS definitely falls into that. The second element is ensuring transparency. We think that consumers all up and down the supply chain have a right to know what is going in consumer products. Often we work with businesses who say that they cannot get information on what is in their supply chain unless states have actually passed regulation requiring that disclosure to happen. And transparency has been a really powerful tool in the past because what we have found is often companies will prefer to reformulate rather than admit that they are using a chemical that causes harm. And so, just like the old adage, sunshine is the best disinfectant, we find that this is also true in chemicals policy. The third plank is investing in safer solutions. And so when we talk about a hazard-based framework and regulating chemicals based on their intrinsic ability to cause harm, part of this is searching for safer alternatives and incentivizing those safer alternatives. So you have states like California, Washington, Maine, and others who are regulating high hazard chemicals, but are looking at it through the lens of, is there a safer alternative? And with PFAS policy, there's actually sort of a new sort of element on top of that is asking the question, is it necessary? So Maine and Minnesota have passed PFAS policy in the past to it's what we call a essential use framework, where it's asking the question, is PFAS actually necessary in this product? And does this product provide some benefit to society in terms of health, safety, or societal function? And if there is a safer alternative, then it's requiring the move to that safer alternatives. And that's the way that we can require and invest in those safer solutions. And finally, the fourth plank to a safer chemicals and materials policy is ensuring accountability. All of the allies in the Safer States Network firmly believe that polluters need to be held accountable for the harm that they have caused. And PFAS has been a really great example of this, where we have over 28 attorneys general around the country that have filed lawsuits against PFAS manufacturers, requiring them to pay for the damage that they have caused. But this also means things like money to make communities whole, medical monitoring, providing, the necessary insurance for people to be able to get the medical care once they are actually exposed to harmful chemicals. We firmly believe that accountability is a necessary component to having a safer chemicals and materials policy. So one of the things that we do is we track legislation that has been introduced around the country. And this year we have over 30 states, and actually this map needs to be updated because a couple of states introduced it since this map was colored in. But we have over 30 states that have introduced policy to eliminate high hazard chemicals, require transparency, investing in safer solutions, or providing for accountability. We heavily curate this list, and so we have our process is really to take all the policies that have been introduced on chemicals and toxics and look at them to make sure that they are falling into that hazard-based framework. And you can see that this is a really popular thing that states have taken on. And PFAS is definitely leading the way. So we are here to talk about PFAS. Let's dig into PFAS. So I'm sure all of you know this, but for maybe the one person who doesn't, PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They are sometimes called forever chemicals because they do not break down in the environment. And it is a really large class of chemicals. At this point, I think at the last point I looked, there were over 15,000 individual PFAS. And so this is where regulation is getting really tricky right now, because there's a lot of dispute over what makes a chemical a PFAS. And so, in consulting with scientists internationally and people who are experts in PFAS, we have come to a definition of this one fully fluorinated carbon atom. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. But really, the whole idea behind the PFAS is this carbon fluorine bond. The carbon fluorine bond is the strongest organic. The strongest bond in organic chemistry. It is chemically and thermally stable. It means it just does not break down under normal conditions. Even in incinerators, PFAS does not break down. So they are incredibly persistent. They last indefinitely, and they travel very long distance, particularly those PFAS that have been exposed to incineration. They travel on air currents. I saw a study several years ago that said that there are about 60 tons of PFAS in the Arctic, and they get there by air current. They're highly bioaccumulative. They build up in our bodies. Our bodies cannot expel PFAS. And they also biomagnify, meaning that they add up in smaller animals. And so as larger animals eat those smaller animals, the PFAS builds up in them. They're mobile in groundwater, and they're extremely difficult to control in the environment. It is estimated that over 100 million Americans are drinking water that has been contaminated with PFAS because they are so mobile and because they are used in everything. So where are PFAS found? Again, I'm sure you all know this is a review, but they are found in a lot of things. So anything that needs grease proofing, waterproofing, any sort of, resistance to oil, PFAS is really good at that. And it's because it's persistent. It's because of that carbon fluorine bond. So it's used in carpets, in food packaging, in cosmetics, in clothing, in nonstick cookware. And so it is found in a lot of things. And two big uses of PFAS right now, which unfortunately are not on this slide. One, it's used a lot in the electronic sector, in semiconductors, and it is used also in HVAC systems. It's one of the coolants that's used in HVAC. And so it gets into our drinking water through a number of different sources. So if you're just looking at from the manufacturing, you have wastewater direct discharge into our rivers and streams and groundwater. Some of them will go into wastewater treatment plants, but the technology to eliminate all PFAS from wastewater treatment plants is incredibly nascent. And it's good at capturing some PFAS, but not all. And so a lot of that PFAS, again, ends up into river and groundwater. It comes in through landfill leachate. So if you think about all those consumer products that I had on the other slide, most of those products at the end of their useful life end up in a landfill. And PFAS leaches out of those products over time and ends up into landfill leachate and again into our rivers and into our groundwater. PFAS also is present in sewage sludge, or as they're affectionately known, biosolids, that are applied onto our farmland. And certain crops are very good at taking up PFAS. And so there are certain kinds of crops that have high levels of PFAS in them. And of course, you have a lot of the traditional methods from the past, like PFAS coated firefighting foam that excuse me, I'm gonna PFAS firefighting foam that was discharged and again ending up in our drinking water, our rivers, our groundwater, and then finally just through exposure to consumer products. So you think about any clothing that has been treated with PFAS, any of our carpets when you wash them, the PFAS is not chemically bound to the material. It's usually a coating that is placed on the material and it comes off. And in fact, one of my scientist friends like to say, as you walk on PFAS treated carpet, you have your own little mini PFAS factory there because all of these side chain polymers break off of the PFAS as you walk on them and are exposing people over time. How do PFAS affect us? Again, I'm sorry for the review, but just for folks who don't know, PFAS have been linked to a number of health conditions, including thyroid disease, increased cholesterol, certain kinds of cancer, um, reduced efficacy of vaccines, lower birth rate, other kinds of birth defects, and preeclampsia. The more that we look for health effects on PFAS, the more that we find. We are now seeing that PFAS also have a role in endocrine disruption, and have been impacting, and because they don't come out of people, because we can't expel them, they are affecting us our entire lives. I also want to point out that PFAS has a role in the climate crisis, and this is really important to remember, particularly as we start thinking about some of the industry arguments around why PFAS are beneficial. So I don't know how many folks have seen this graph, but really the global plastics production and global chemical industry sales are expected to skyrocket over the next several decades. And it's because when the demand of fossil fuels for gasoline decreases, the chemical and oil industry needs to have an escape valve, and chemicals and plastics are it. So fossil fuels are responsible for multiple crises. PFAS is made from fossil fuels, and making chemicals is incredibly energy intensive. We know that chemical production and plastic production are huge contributors to climate change. Also, families that are living near these facilities are heavily impacted and more impacted than the rest of the population. What we are seeing is that plastics and chemical production could actually undo any kind of climate progress that we are making. And finally, as someone living in California, and I see that there are a couple others here from California, we know that toxic chemicals can make these climate change disasters far worse. The recent fires in California and Southern California, the smoke was highly toxic because of all of the chemicals that were burning in people's homes. And so as we see more and more climate-related disasters, the toxic chemicals that we use in our homes and that are part of our everyday lives are magnifying the impacts from those climate change disasters. PFAS also, again, I'm sorry this is review, but I just want to let folks know that there is a long history of deception from the chemical industry as it relates to PFAS. This is one of those chemicals that the chemical industry has knew for decades caused harm. They knew that it was toxic back in the 1950s, that these chemicals were toxic in rodents and that they were causing their harm to workers. They discovered in the 1960s and 70s that women who worked with these chemicals were giving birth to babies who had birth defects, but they did not inform the EPA or the public. They attempted to silence communities for several years, and it really wasn't until a lawsuit in the late 90s, early 2000s that was finally resolved a few years back, did they finally start accepting some kind of blame for what they have had done. Um, and so the big question that we are facing right now is, are some PFAS safer than others? And really, the short answer to that is no. Again, it's because of that carbon fluorine bond that makes these chemicals persist in the environment that that makes these chemicals highly toxic. So they might differ in their longevity and the rate of absorption into our blood, but every class of PFAS poses a health risk. And I want to talk a little bit about this in relation to what we are hearing the chemical lobby say. So I've been doing this work for over 20 years. I remember when the first bills were introduced in the state of California to ban the use of the long chain PFAS. So that's the PFAS that have at least 8 carbon molecules. So they're called C8. So these carbon fluorine chains, at least 8 of them, and they're called these long chains. And so those are the chemicals that are sort of known as the like historical PFAS, the PFOA and PFOS. And so bills were introduced back in 2004, 2005, 2006 to try to ban these chemicals from certain applications. And I was there, and I remember the chemical industry saying, these chemicals are fine. You don't need to worry about them. All the hype has been completely overblown. They're fine. Then there was a lot more evidence that came to pass, and the chemical industry finally decided to admit, yeah, okay, these long chains, they are problematic. We're going to go ahead and phase them out. But there are these magical new C6s, these shorter chain PFAS. These are totally fine. Again, evidence starts mounting that these chemicals are not fine, that they have the exact same problems that the C8s did. And so all of a sudden now what we're hearing from the chemical industry is, you know what? You're right. Some of those C6s are a problem. But gosh, these ultra short chain fluorinated gases or the long polymers, those are okay. And what you're seeing is constantly the moving of the line from the chemical industry. But what we're seeing from the science is that there is no such thing as a safe PFAS. And so that's why states are really lumping all of the PFAS into one category and are trying to regulate all of them at once. So, what has been the government and the market response to PFAS? So first of all, the federal response. The federal response has been largely looking at end of pipe. So it's not really focused on prevention or trying to turn off the tap on PFAS, but looking at how can we, help out, how can we control PFAS in drinking water and in other environmental media. And so last year, new enforceable drinking water standards were enacted. 4 parts per trillion for the 2 legacy PFAS, PFOA and PFOS, and 10 parts per trillion for 3 other PFAS. However, we are in a new dawn, a new day. That is not fun to live in. And what we have learned last week is that the EPA is going to scrap the second part, the 10 parts per trillion, and reassess that. So there is, and we've also heard that there is a move to reassess all of the other policies that have passed to try to just gain a better understanding of where PFAS is being used. So that really relies on the states. And so I'm sorry, I know that this slide is kind of small, but there's a good link on the bottom here, and I can make sure to share that with all of you. So this has been the state response to PFAS. So states have also passed drinking water standards, but states have really been leading the way when it comes to prevention and what we call turning off the tap on PFAS. And so you can see there are 15 states so far that have regulated PFAS in a variety of consumer products. And so things like clothing, carpeting, cleaning products, cookware, firefighting foam has been the most prevalent, food packaging, kids products, cosmetics. And so a number of states have been taking the lead and continue to take the lead on regulating PFAS in consumer products to try to eliminate it from our environment altogether. Also, we have had a number of brands and retailers make commitments on PFAS in consumer products. So certain grocery chains like Ahold Delhaize and Albertsons, who own large grocery conglomerates have made commitments to eliminate PFAS from food packaging. Places like IKEA have done a really remarkable job of getting PFAS out of all of its products. Places like Patagonia and REI have made commitments to getting PFAS out of the clothing that they sell as well. So this is a train that is moving, and we have been really successful in getting PFAS out of a number of products. The big issue right now is with how do we define PFAS? So I talked about this earlier when we said, is there a safe PFAS? An industry constantly trying to move to move the ball, and this is happening again. So right now we have, as I said, over 15,000 different kinds of PFAS, and we need to define them accurately. And there is broad scientific consensus that defining PFAS as a chemical with at least one fully fluorinated carbon is scientifically accurate. And the states that I listed on the previous chart, all of these states, plus another 10 states, define PFAS in this way. So we have 25 states, the Department of Defense, the OECD, all have the same definition. The problem comes with the EPA. So the EPA really has no standard definition of PFAS. They decided back in 2023 to define PFAS on a case-by-case basis. And in fact, one of the leading scientists and experts on PFAS, Linda Birnbaum, who was the former director of the National Toxicology Program and NIEHS, said this is not a definition, it's a non-definition. And so the definition that the chemical lobby has been pushing is the one that's used under the Toxic Substances Control Act reporting rule. And unfortunately, that definition excludes entire types of PFAS, like the fluorinated gases and the PFAS and certain kinds of PFAS polymers. And so that is the definition that is being pushed by the chemical lobby in many, many states, and that we are trying to push against right now. So the two types of PFAS that I mentioned that industry is trying to exempt from being regulated are polymers and gases. And it just so happens to be that these are the most used PFAS and the most profitable PFAS. So let's talk about polymers. They're also called polymerics or fluoropolymers. And so we really have started calling them plastic PFAS because that's really what they are. A polymer is just a long chain of monomers strung together to form kind of a plasticized sort of chemical. And so they're used in a lot of different applications. So a lot of those things that states have regulated, like cookware, clothing, furniture, polymers are used in those applications, but they're also used a lot in electronics, particularly in semiconductors and in chip manufacturing. They also have a lot of industrial applications, including pipes and gaskets. And so the chemical lobby is expecting a large growth in fluoropolymers, particularly since the passage of the CHIPS Act, that there's going to be a lot more manufacturing in America. And so they are using that fact to try to scare lawmakers away from regulating fluoropolymers. Fluoropolymers are a major source of PFAS emissions, and industry's claiming that these are safe. And so some of the claims that they are using is saying, well, they're so large that they don't stay in our bodies and they're expelled quickly. And again, industry is really just looking at maybe sort of one part of a product's life cycle. And unfortunately, we need to look at PFAS throughout the entire life cycle. So I like to think about polymers. Actually, let me go up to the previous slide. I like to think about polymers as a tower of Legos. So each individual Lego is its own monomer, and that's stacked on top of each other, right? And so as long as that tower of Legos stays on your desk or stays on the floor and nobody touches it, it's going to be fine. But that's not how things work in the real world. So you think about, again, that tower of Legos. If you bump it, some of those Legos pop off. You eventually throw that tower of Legos away, those Legos are going to start to crumble. The same thing is true with fluoropolymers. As long as it's stable and used exactly how it's supposed to be used, that fluoropolymer is probably pretty stable. But if you think about cookware, And cookware is a great example. And you think about a Teflon pan and you're scraping that Teflon pan with a metal spatula, little flakes of these fluoropolymers are coming off in the form of microplastics, and they're getting into us and they're getting into our environment. And so this argument that polymers are stable and safe completely ignores the entire life cycle of PFAS. And so that's something that we're trying to get folks to understand, is that it's not just in the use of the product itself, but it's in the manufacture and the disposal of that product, that PFAS plastics, fluoropolymers are highly problematic. Um, so I think it's worth noting that the contamination that we've heard about in West Virginia, the dark water story with starring Mark Ruffalo, the contamination that we've heard about in North Carolina that really exposed all the C6 chemicals, all of that contamination came from PFAS polymer production. PFAS polymers are still persistent and can break apart, leach in landfills, like I just say. They can form these micro and nano particles, and again, they're not destroyed by conventional incineration. Um, I also want to point out that there was a paper that the OECD came out with looking at polymers of high concern and low concern. Industry likes to trot out that these polymers, that PFAS polymers were considered low concern. And I think it's just really important to note that OECD did not say that. They did not classify any PFAS as safe or of low concern. Um, and finally, any exemption of fluoropolymers would exempt the chemicals that have been found in the blood of firefighters. So fluoropolymers are highly problematic, and any attempts to exempt them is also problematic. Unfortunately, industry has started making certain inroads. A policy passed earlier this year in New Mexico that would regulate PFAS in all consumer products. It was based off of a law passed in Maine and Minnesota. And so it's a really sprawling law requiring disclosure and banning PFAS in all consumer products by 2032, using that essential use framework that I talked about at the top. Unfortunately, it exempts all fluoropolymers from the policy. So it really renders that policy toothless because most of the PFAS that are used in consumer products are fluoropolymers. And I talked a little bit about the fate of polymeric PFAS in products. So you have here this Teflon scratched pan, which if any of you have ever rented a VRBO, you know that this is the fate of Teflon pans. You know, you think about as you clean carpets, as you wash your clothes, as they end up in landfills, these PFAS plastics get out and get into our drinking water. The other class of chemicals that the chemical lobby is trying to exempt from regulation is fluorinated gases. So these are the ultra short chain PFAS. And the argument here is really insidious because what is being said is that these types of PFAS are necessary for the clean energy transition. Because they are used in heat pumps as refrigerants, they're used in, in cars as air conditionings, as air conditioning coolant. And the most popular are something called HFOs or hydrofluoroolefins. Now, HFOs are a substitute for hydrofluorocarbons. Hydrofluorocarbons were a substitute for CFCs. So CFCs was harming the ozone. We switched to HFCs, which we realized had high global warming potential. And now the move has been to switch to HFOs, which do have a lower global warming potential than HFCs, but they are not safe. And EPA has not evaluated HFOs for chronic toxicity. They do look at acute toxicity, but for chronic toxicity, they don't look at that. HFOs, as they're released in the environment, transform into a potent water contaminant called TFA. I promise there's not going to be a quiz on TFA, HFO later on. Maybe there is, but there shouldn't be. It's highly confusing. All that to say is TFA is naturally occurring in the environment, but levels of TFA are rising over the last 10 years, and scientists attribute it to the increased use of HFOs in refrigerants. Um, the great news is that there are alternatives to F gases that are already on the market and are being used, particularly in the European Union. Um, but again, they are a huge growth market for the PFAS industry. Right now, they are responsible for about 60% of all PFAS emissions. And so there is a huge move by the chemical lobby and others to try to exempt these gases from regulation. And the EPA definition that I mentioned earlier, that is highly problematic, exempts fluorinated gases from the definition. And so it's making things really, really tricky for states and making things very confusing. But I think the bottom line is that PFAS are PFAS. There is no such thing as a safe or an even safer PFAS. And anybody who says something is literally trying to sell PFAS. So who wants this definition change? Well, I've mentioned already the chemical lobby. The chemical lobby goes by the name of the American Chemistry Council. It is a trade organization made up of all the different chemical manufacturers around the world. But we also have two new players in the last 2 years. The first one is the Cookware Sustainability Alliance. And this is a brand new trade association that started about a year ago by the two largest manufacturers of cookware. And their entire reason for being is to go from state to state, particularly states that have already passed laws regulating PFAS in cookware, and asking those states to open up those laws and to exempt cookware. I'm very happy to say that at this point, no state has done that. They also filed a lawsuit in Minnesota that was I don't know if it was thrown out, but they were defeated. They were trying to have an injunction passed to stop the implementation of Minnesota's PFAS ban in cookware. That was unsuccessful. But they are incredibly aggressive. And I'm getting calls from legislators and advocates at least once a week, certainly at the beginning of legislative session this year, almost every single day, saying the cookware industry is here and they're saying that polymers are safe. Because what do they use in their cookware? They use PFAS polymers. And so they are some of the ones who are trying to pass off fluoropolymers as safe. The other organization that's cropped up in the last couple of years is a trade group called the Sustainable PFAS Action Network. So who are they? What is SPAN? So they are HVAC manufacturers, chip manufacturers, semiconductor industry, and they have come together again to try to change the definition of PFAS so that it would exclude fluoropolymers and fluorinated gases. And SPAN is the trade association that is out there for the most part saying that PFAS are necessary for the climate transition. The law that passed in New Mexico that I mentioned that exempted fluoropolymers, when I spoke to the lawmakers there, they said, no, 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 we have to do this. It is necessary for climate. The other reason is that lawmakers are afraid, particularly with semiconductor and chip manufacturing coming to certain states. The Conductor Association and other chip manufacturers are threatening to pull out of a state if they do not exempt PFAS polymers and fluorinated gases from their laws. So what are they going to say? Well, things that I said earlier, they're going to say most PFAS are bad, but trust us, the kind we use are totally fine. Even if my product isn't regulated, this bill still puts me out of business. We had a bill in Indiana, and we heard from medical device manufacturers, which were not being regulated, and nobody's trying to regulate medical devices. And they said, well, this bill is going to drive medical device manufacturing out of the state. Jobs will leave the state. It's going to slow down manufacturing. And PFAS are necessary for the clean energy transition. So we also have some threats on the federal level. The PFAS definition is already under attack. There is a draft bill right now by Carper and Capito that would narrow the definition of PFAS to that EPA definition. We still have that bad EPA definition under the TSCA reporting rule. As I said, the PFAS maximum contamination levels in drinking water is likely going to falter. We also are hearing in the last couple of weeks that the Toxic Substances Control Act, the law that governs how chemicals are regulated in the country, could be reopened. That law was reauthorized in 2016, and it is not perfect. We don't love it. But one of the good things about the law that was passed is it still allowed states to act. It still gave them the authority to be able to regulate chemicals in their state. Our fear is that if this is open, particularly under this Congress and this administration, that state preemption will become the law of the land and it will take away states' ability to act. And so it's really critical that as many of us get engaged in this fight and other preemption fights as possible. And so what we need from states is we need, states to be really educated on this issue, and we need states to be really poised to act, really at a moment's notice when these federal threats crop up. The good news is we have a lot of resources on our website. We have a toolkit, a policy toolkit that goes through a lot of what I just talked about. It has a lot of links to helpful studies and resources for folks who are interested in getting involved. We have fact sheets on the definition. We have that handy dandy chart that you all couldn't see, but is very useful. That'll tell you what state have taken action on what. We have good information on manufacturer and retailer action. And we also help craft testimony. Um, we have a great letter from over 150 scientists, PFAS experts on the definition of PFAS, and we have some good candidate education guides that we have used throughout the years that are really evergreen that help educate candidates on our issues. And finally, I'm a resource. So, and actually, Sarah is probably the best resource for you all at this point. What are the things that we really need from nurses in particular? You all know that you are the one of the most, if not the most trusted profession in America. Um, when people hear what I'm talking about from me, they tend to roll their eyes. When you say it, it is a completely different ballgame. So we need nurses who are available to provide testimony, who are willing to meet with legislators on this issue, who are educated in all the sort of ins and outs of a PFAS definition and can speak intelligently to it. And we need nurses who are able to talk about the impacts that they are seeing in their communities, particularly those who are heavily impacted by PFAS. So whether that's communities that are near polluting facilities or communities that have high levels of drinking water contamination. Telling those personal stories is what is actually going to be the most helpful. And I'm just going to close and talk about, why we're here. So for folks who don't know, this is Amara Strandy, who is testifying right now, who's testifying in this picture. And she is a young woman from Minnesota who was diagnosed with a rare liver cancer at the age of 14 after drinking water that had been contaminated by a 3M, but that had been contaminated by 3M with PFAS. And she spent the final weeks of her life advocating for a law in Minnesota that would ban the use of PFAS in all consumer products unless the use of that PFAS was currently unavoidable. It is very easy with this issue and with all chemical issues to get into, you know, distinctions between gases, one or two carbon chains, polymerics or non-polymerics. That is where the chemical industry loves to live because it stays esoteric, it stays intellectual, and it doesn't actually get at the root of the problem of why we are doing what we are doing, which is to protect people like Amara. We couldn't protect her, but we can protect her sister. We can protect future Amaras from going through their illness. The other thing that I have noticed a lot is, particularly from the chemical lobby and from consumer product manufacturers, is talking about this is just so hard. It is really hard to eliminate PFAS from our products. It is hard to find out from our supply chain what is used. They often don't know. Gosh, we really feel for industry, is what I heard one lawyer on a podcast talk about recently. But I spoke to Dana Strandy, Amara's mom, and I spoke to her about this, and she said, "I want to tell you what's really hard. What is really hard is taking your doctor or your daughter from to doctor to doctor to doctor all around the country trying to cure her. Hard is getting one medical bill, the first medical bill that was $900,000, and knowing that we will never be able to pay for Amara's care." So another role that you can play that is incredibly valuable is bringing that human element into these stories and into this work, making sure that lawmakers aren't forgetting why we're doing what we're doing. We're not here because we're afraid of chemicals. We're not here because we want capitalism to fail. We're not here because we want business to fail. We're here because we don't want more Amara Strandys, and we wanted Amara to be able to live a full life. So thank you so much for what you have done, what you continue to do. Thank you so much to Annie. Your advocacy this session has been instrumental in stopping a lot of the bad things happening in states. And so I am very happy to stop now, and I'm going to take questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Gretchen. That was a great amount of information. I know our nurses are really interested in this. Um, I just want to underscore that we have a lot of opportunities. We are allies with Safer States, and there are all kinds of opportunities that come up in the states. And I always am going through my list and I'm thinking who wants to, who's interested in PFAS and who wants to speak at a hearing. So if any of you are interested in, writing a letter or speaking at a hearing, definitely let me know, because we, have needs, sometimes a letter to the editor, sometimes a bill comes up. So just wanted to put that out there. We did have a question in the chat from Debbie. What is the effect of heat on polymers and fluoropolymers like cookware?
Yeah. So that's a really good question, Debbie. I'm so happy you brought it up because I forgot to mention it in my presentation. So there is something that is literally called the Teflon flu. And so when polymers, and particularly when PTFE, the type of polymer that's used in nonstick pans, are heated, they off gas, and people can get sick. And it presents as flu-like symptoms, but the onset isn't for a couple of hours, so most people ignore it. But they're starting to track Teflon flu, and there have been a few hundred cases reporting, which we know is vastly underreported. The other piece of this that is really, I mean, it's just kind of mind-blowing to me is that the Teflon, Chemours, the manufacturer, one of the manufacturers of Teflon, literally has on their website, do not cook with Teflon coated pans with birds in your kitchen because it's going to kill your birds. And so they have it on their website that the chemicals that off gas from the pans are highly toxic to birds, yet they're telling all of us that it's fine for you to use. And so it's literally the canary in your kitchen that is suffering the effects of Teflon flu and heated polymers. So yeah, so polymers do break down when they are exposed to heat, and they'll come off in the form of gas.
Sorry, my screen froze. Catherine, I think you had a question. Did you have your hand up, Catherine? I'm sorry.
I got to know. I just put up a heart because this was such a great presentation. It's great to see you.
Good to see you too, Catherine.
I just had a question. Well, I do have a question. I put in above. Really, Amazon and Home Depot have agreed not to sell PFAS. I just find that really hard to believe.
It's
And I wanted to point out that some of the major food packagers or fast food packagers, Chipotle, I'm forgetting who else, have agreed not to put it in their packaging. Because of course you're getting hot food in a package that's coated with PFAS,
yeah.
so that it won't leak into your pants and stain your pants. And McDonald's was pressured by the European Union, and they're supposed to be stopping, I believe, in 2026 using
Yeah.
PFAS in their packaging.
Yeah. So Amazon and Home Depot, again, it's a very narrow list of products that they have
Okay,
agreed to not have PFAS in. So it's not everything.
got it.
Yeah.
And I just put in the chat a quote. Last night I was on a call with Bruce Lamphir, a famous pediatrician, and and it was about lead, but someone brought up artificial turf at the end, and PFAS and artificial turf, which is great. But he put in this quote that was shoot, now I can't even read it. And this was from 1925. That it was about lead. This is probably the greatest single question in the field of public health that has ever faced the American public. It is the question whether scientific experts are to be consulted and the action of the government guided by their advice, or whether, on the contrary, commercial interests are to be allowed to subordinate every other consideration to that of profit. That size of financial interests involved is stupendous. It's not a matter of millions or even hundreds of millions, but literally billions. This was in 1925, and I just thought I'm going to use this in every testimony I give if I have more than 2 minutes to talk, because here we are, 1925, 100 years ago, they were pointing out that industry is controlling our safety, and I just think we need to speak out about it. So that's my spiel.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That's a great quote. So we also have Jill in the chat. Jill, did you want to talk a little bit about, I know you're doing some testimony tonight in New Jersey.
Yeah. Yes, I actually have to leave in 5 minutes, but quickly, yes. I work with the Ramapo Lenape Turtle Clan in Ringwood, New Jersey. I live in Sussex County, New Jersey, an hour from the Superfund site where the Turtle Clan lives. Ford Motor Company in the 60s and 70s dumped their toxic paint sludge and other toxics on the Ramapo land. And the tribe is dying of very rare cancers at alarming rates. In addition, their PFAS levels are through the roof. We are going to be reporting to them tonight at a town hall meeting. It will be on Facebook Live at 6 p.m. New Jersey time. We will be discussing with them the PFAS levels. We have done 82 blood and urine samples of tribal members thus far. We started doing this July 2023. We have 82 members of the tribe that have volunteered to give blood and urine. And the PFAS levels are astounding. They're absolutely terrifying. And I actually did an infographic on PFAS, and we're going to be, we have mailed home letters to them in addition to the infographic, letting them know individually, confidentially, what their PFAS levels are. So I will also be bringing the PFAS infographic to the members today who have still not done blood and urine collection. So they are aware that it's really important for them to get tested, because we need to connect them with medical providers who can help them if they have very high PFAS levels. The other thing that we're struggling to understand is some of the tribal members live in Sussex County, where I live, which is an hour from the Superfund site. They are showing the same levels of different maladies in their blood and urine that the Ramapo who live on the Superfund site are showing, and we don't understand why. We really, I work at NYU Medical School in the Environmental Medicine Division, and we're perplexed. We don't understand why tribal members who live an hour off the Superfund site, nowhere near the Superfund site, are showing similar medical maladies as the tribal members who live on the Superfund site. So, you know, any thoughts? We would love to know, because we can't figure it out.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
If
lastly,
you who works in environmental health like all day doesn't know, that I certainly don't know.
yeah. And Sarah, you had said if anybody needs to, if anybody's willing to speak to Congress, to, you know, I've spoken to Congress about electric school buses. I will get my butt down to DC from New Jersey if you need me, because this is really critical. We need to do something about this. And again, I've been working with the Turtle Clan for since 2022, and the more and more we're finding medically from their urine and blood samples, it's just devastating to me that nobody is doing anything about this. And this is typical of Native Americans across the country. I mean, this is not just the Ramapo in New Jersey. If you look at tribal members across the nation, what medical maladies they have from industry, it is just terrifying what these people are going through. So thank you again for your presentation. It's phenomenal.
Well, thanks for the work you do, Jill. And I would love to hook you up with the folks in Clean Water Action New Jersey, because they do have a PFAS bill moving in New Jersey right now.
Super. Yes. I'll have to hop off, but Sarah, if Gretchen connect me, I would be thrilled. Everybody be well. And thank you for all you do.
Thanks.
So
good luck.
So there was another question here in the chat about what medical treatments are known to treat PFAS effects. So one of the, and I'll just put a plug in here for another issue that nurses could really help on. Right now, only one state covers PFAS blood testing. So usually when people want a PFAS test, and Gretchen, let me know if I'm saying this wrong, as far as insurance coverage. But yeah, only one state, which is New Hampshire, requires, you know, insurers in New Hampshire to cover the test. So it can be very costly. So that is a barrier that we are asking nurses to speak up about, so that insurers do cover the blood tests. Debbie, to answer your question, once you get your PFAS tested, there's a range of PFAS, and it's in our toolkit that actually whichever range you're at, there's a bunch of follow-up tests that can be done. And these are all things that we do in healthcare, you know, checking cholesterol, screening for breast cancer. So it's a lot of stuff that we are already doing. It's not a specific treatment. It's really having the provider be aware that the patient has a high level and to look out and be proactive about, looking for these future issues, which are higher in folks who have certain types of PFAS. And there are limitations to PFAS testing because there's only, certain ones that are tested for, and as I mentioned, the insurance issue, but people are interested in knowing their levels. And we want to also be sure that clinicians, like everyone on this call, are getting the education they need, because we know this isn't always covered, it's not covered in nursing schools or medical schools. This is an emerging science. So we know that clinicians are really interested in finding out more. So also educating yourself and educating your colleagues.
There's a movement happening also with the CIEL, Center for International Environmental Law, is trying to put together a cohort of health professionals, particularly in the Gulf South and in Appalachia. But one of the things that they are asking is to get exposure information on patient questionnaires. So asking things like, do you live near a polluting facility? What kind of occupation do you have? Things so that can be triggers for, for additional testing. Because right now it's just not standard on all medical questionnaires to ask those kinds of questions. And particularly in places like the Gulf South in Appalachia, where you have a lot of chemical production, it's really important to really understand where people are living, so you can, see if there's some sort of environmental component or things that you need to be watching out more for.
Thank you, Gretchen. That's great information. And I'm going to put in the chat Annie's toolkit, which does outline some of the medical conditions you want to be looking for if patients do come back with PFAS levels in their blood that are of a certain elevation. Tom?
Thanks for the talk. I would imagine that as poor countries in the world become more modernized, plastics become more important to them. So the EU accepted. What is the international? Do you have any idea what the international landscape looks like with respect to both plastics and maybe PFAS?
Sure. So this is one of the rare areas where the United States is leading, where they're ahead of everybody else on PFAS. And it's really down to the states. It's because the states are leading on this issue. So there is a move right now in the EU to try to regulate PFAS, but the EU just underwent a political transition. And so that is probably going to be set back or put on hold right now. So there's not a whole lot that's being done in the EU. France passed a ban on PFAS in certain consumer products, but unfortunately the Cookware Sustainability Alliance got to them and exempted cookware and foodware from their ban. So the country that's actually the furthest ahead is the United States. And so we have actually had lawmakers from Australia, from Japan, from other places get in touch with our state advocates and ask us, what should we be doing? How did you do this? And in fact, one of my colleagues just testified in Australia. She had to testify over Zoom. She didn't get a free trip out of it. She was quite bummed. But yeah, she's testifying in Australia, and that's just on, things like firefighting foam and other consumer products. So we are a little bit, we're ahead of other countries. On plastics, it's very different. We are very behind on plastics regulation as compared to the rest of the world. And a lot of that has just been kind of built into how they live their lives, which is different from the way we live ours. I could do a whole other presentation on plastics and the problem with the ways that states have been approaching plastics, which has really been from a waste management lens and not really from a prevention lens, and the shift that we are trying to make and that we think is being made for lawmakers away from just a waste only approach to a plastics and health approach. But yeah, we're a bit further behind than other countries in the plastic space. And yes, Catherine, Safer States Up does have model legislative language on PFAS and on plastics. So we don't have that up on our website because what we have noticed is that lawmakers tend to run with it, and as you say, will introduce amendments that they don't quite understand, and then they set really bad precedent. So we try to control where those laws are, or at least have knowledge of where those laws are introduced. So if you want them, I can happily provide them to you.
Thanks. And Catherine, you had one other question here about should PFAS testing be for total fluorine rather than testing for the 15,000 chemicals? That is I'm not sure. That's a-
Yeah. Yeah, so they're doing the total fluorine tests, in water and consumer products. That's what they use. And I think can do a total fluorine test for blood. I don't know the cost of it, and I don't know how involved that is. I know that we don't have assays for all 15,000 PFAS, right? And so a lot of times what the total fluorine test is sort of an indication of like, yeah, it's probably there, and you can investigate further to see, which ones are present. But again, like it's really, I mean, the science on this is really, really challenging and difficult. And so one of our planks that I know, for a lot of you is this feeling of like, we know enough to act, right? And so let's not wait for the science to be 100% perfect for us to have assays on all 15,000 for us to, we know enough to act. People are being harmed right now. And so let's do what we can right now. Yeah.
That's great. Does anyone else have any additional questions? I feel like we ended on the perfect note, Gretchen, with you saying we know enough. So we know enough to act. Please do look at our toolkit. Check out the Safer States website. They have a ton of materials. They're a great organization. And if you're interested, in getting involved in state level stuff, please do let me know. You'll be getting an email from me probably tomorrow with just all the materials, the recording of today, and a link to the post test. So thank you all for coming. And thank you, Gretchen. We really appreciate your expertise.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciate all you do.
Thank you.
Care, folks. Bye.